The early morning sun hadn't yet reached the top of the city's tallest building when Ray's plumbing van pulled into the underground parking garage. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting his navy blue work uniform and making sure his graying hair was neatly combed. 20 years of running his own plumbing business had taught him that first impressions mattered, even if some clients barely looked at him. His phone buzzed with a message: "Pipe leak in penthouse server room. Emergency service needed." The text was simple enough, but Ray knew better. Behind his carefully maintained identity as a neighborhood plumber, he was actually one of the government's most effective intelligence operatives. His plumbing business wasn't just a cover. He'd spent years learning the trade properly and took pride in doing good work. It was the perfect way to enter any building without raising suspicion. The security guard at the desk barely glanced at his ID badge before waving him through. "Penthouse has been calling nonstop about this leak," the guard grumbled. "Better you than me dealing with Mr. Wells. Guy thinks everyone's beneath him." Ray just smiled and nodded, shouldering his heavy toolbox. The weight was familiar. Along with standard plumbing tools, it contained some of the most sophisticated surveillance equipment available. But no one ever looked twice at a plumber's tools. The private elevator to the penthouse required a special key card, which the guard provided with another tired wave. As Ray rode up 60 floors, he mentally reviewed what his agency knew about Benjamin Wells. The tech billionaire had made his fortune developing security software for banks, but intelligence suggested he was using his access to steal data and money from those same banks. They just needed proof. The elevator doors opened directly into a marble-floored entryway larger than most apartments. The wall of windows offered a stunning view of the city below, but Ray kept his eyes down as a tall man in an expensive suit approached. "You're late," Wells snapped, though Ray was exactly on time. "I've got important meetings today." "I don't need some plumber making noise and mess all over my home." "Sorry about that, sir," Ray replied softly, noting how Wells didn't even look at him while speaking. "I'll try to work quickly and quietly. Could you show me where the leak is?" Wells sighed dramatically, as if being asked to do something terribly beneath him. "Follow me. And don't touch anything except what you're fixing. Everything in here costs more than you make in a year." Ray followed silently, taking in every detail of the penthouse. His trained eyes noted the security camera positions, the electronic locks on certain doors, and especially the supple signs of recent renovations around what appeared to be a server room. The agency's intel suggested that Wells had installed a sophisticated system for intercepting banking data, and the layout of the penthouse was already confirming their suspicions. The leak was coming from a pipe near the server room's cooling system, exactly where Ray's team had predicted there might be a vulnerability in Wells' security. As he knelt to examine the pipe, he could hear Wells talking on his phone. "Yes, they finally sent someone. No, just some local plumber. Probably can't even read half the words in his own manual." "I know, but it was the only service that could come on short notice. Don't worry, he won't go anywhere near the important areas." Ray allowed himself a small smile as he opened his toolbox. If Wells had bothered to run a real background check, he might have discovered that his local plumber spoke 6 languages, had advanced degrees in computer science and engineering, and had spent decades working high-level intelligence operations. But people like Wells never bothered to look closely at people they considered beneath them. The leak itself was minor, a loose fitting that would take minutes to fix. But Ray took his time setting up his tools, positioning himself perfectly to observe the server room layout. His work badge, which Wells hadn't even glanced at, was already transmitting detailed scans of the nearby equipment. "Hey," Wells' sharp voice interrupted his work. "Be careful with those servers. They're worth more than you'll see in your lifetime." "No worries, sir," Ray answered mildly. "I've worked around sensitive equipment before." It was technically true, though the sensitive equipment usually involved national security rather than stolen banking data. The morning light was starting to stream through the windows when Ray heard the elevator doors open again. Multiple voices echoed from the entryway. Wells' first business meeting of the day was arriving. Ray adjusted his position slightly, ensuring his hidden cameras would have a clear view of everyone who entered. Just another ordinary morning for a plumber, he thought to himself as he carefully tightened a pipe fitting. though he had a feeling this particular job was about to get much more interesting. The massive penthouse living room buzzed with activity as Ray knelt by the exposed pipes under the kitchen sink. He could hear expensive shoes clicking on marble floors and the murmur of conversations in multiple languages. Mr. Wells was hosting what he called a small business meeting, though Ray had already counted 12 people arriving in the last hour. "As you can see, gentlemen, our security measures are absolutely top-notch," Wells was saying, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who loved the sound of their own words. "Nobody gets in or out of this building without my knowledge." Ray had to suppress a small smile as he carefully loosened a pipe fitting. If Wells only knew that the quiet plumber in his kitchen had already documented every face that walked through his door, capturing their images with a tiny camera hidden in his work badge. The group of businessmen moved closer to the kitchen, their reflection visible in the polished surface of the refrigerator. Ray could see their expensive suits and watches that probably cost more than his van. Wells was leading them on what he clearly thought was an impressive tour of his home. "Oh, and please excuse the," Wells waved his hand dismissively in Ray's direction, "maintenance situation. You know how it is with these service people, they only seem to know how to work during peak hours." He laughed, and several of his guests joined in, though a few looked uncomfortable with his tone. Ray kept working, playing his role perfectly. Every now and then, he would mutter something technical about water pressure and pipe angles, just loud enough to be heard, but quiet enough to seem like he was talking to himself. It was amazing how people would completely ignore someone they thought was beneath their notice. "You know," Wells continued, now clearly using Ray's presence to show off to his guests, "I had to explain the job to him 3 times this morning. These people, they just don't have the capacity for complex thinking. That's why they end up fixing pipes instead of running companies." One of the guests, a woman in a crisp business suit, frowned slightly. "Perhaps he's just focused on doing his job properly," she said, but Wells waved off her comment. "Oh, trust me, I know their type. Watch this. Hey, plumber." Wells raised his voice unnecessarily. "Can you explain to my guests exactly what you're doing under there?" Ray looked up, carefully maintaining his mild-mannered expression. "Yes, sir. I'm replacing the corroded section of the P-trap and checking the connection to the main line to ensure proper drainage flow." His explanation was clear and professional, but he deliberately kept his voice soft and his eyes down. "See what I mean?" Wells laughed. "Probably memorized that from a manual. I doubt he even understands half those words himself." While Wells continued entertaining his guests with more snide comments, Ray was noticing far more interesting things, like how 3 of the visitors kept checking their phones in a synchronized pattern, or how the briefcase held by the man in the gray suit was handcuffed to his wrist, or the way they all carefully stayed out of view of the penthouse's security cameras, except for the ones Ray knew were secretly sending footage to his agency. The morning stretched on, and Wells seemed to grow more confident and careless with each passing hour. He started discussing business matters openly, probably assuming the simple plumber couldn't possibly understand the complexity of his international dealings. "The transfer must happen tonight," one of the men was saying. "The banks will be upgrading their security protocols by tomorrow morning." "Everything is in place," Wells assured them. "Our little project has been running smoothly for months now. By this time tomorrow, we'll all be significantly richer men." He paused to look at Ray again. "Unlike some people who'll spend their whole lives crawling around under sinks." Ray focused on tightening the last fitting, his skilled hands moving with practiced efficiency. In his ear, the tiny receiver hidden by his collar was picking up every word, transmitting it all to his team. He thought about how shocked these arrogant men would be if they knew that the simple plumber they'd been mocking had already identified 3 known cyber criminals among their group and documented enough evidence to put them all away for a very long time. But for now, he just nodded respectfully when Wells made another cutting remark about his intelligence. After all, Ray knew something that the billionaire didn't. Sometimes the best disguise isn't a fake mustache or a fancy suit, but simply being the kind of person others choose not to see. And by the time Wells figured that out, it would be far too late. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the penthouse windows as Ray made his way back to the server room. He'd spent the morning strategically working on different pipes throughout the massive apartment, each location giving him perfect angles to observe Wells' meetings. Now it was time to investigate the heart of the operation. Make sure you don't mess with any of the cooling systems, Wells called out as he passed by. Those servers are handling millions in transactions right now. He smirked, clearly enjoying the thought of dealing with such large sums of money in front of someone he assumed made barely enough to get by. No problem, sir, Ray replied quietly. I'll just be checking the connection points to make sure there are no other potential leaks. What he didn't mention was how his trained eye had already spotted the modifications to the cooling system, clever changes that would be invisible to most people, even experienced plumbers. As he worked, Ray could hear Wells in the next room, his voice carrying that special kind of arrogance that came from believing no one around him was smart enough to understand what he was really saying. The new system is working perfectly, Wells was telling someone on the phone. Nobody suspects a thing. The bank's security teams are too busy looking for sophisticated cyber attacks to notice that we're using their own cooling systems to access their data. Ray carefully positioned his body to block any view of his hands as he took detailed photos of the modified pipes. The setup was actually quite ingenious. They had modified the water cooling system to create a completely separate network, hidden in plain sight. Anyone checking the building's systems would just see normal maintenance modifications. Hey, plumber! Wells' sharp voice interrupted his thoughts. What's taking so long in there? Don't tell me this is too complicated for you to handle. Just being thorough, sir, Ray answered, his voice maintaining its mild tone. These high-end systems can be tricky. Wouldn't want to cause any problems with your important work. He gestured vaguely at the servers, playing up the role of someone who didn't quite understand what he was looking at. Wells stepped into the room, his expensive shoes clicking on the polished floor. Let me explain this in simple terms, he said, speaking slowly as if talking to a child. These machines need to stay cool. The pipes need to work. That's all you need to worry your little head about. Yes, sir, Ray nodded, secretly amused at how Wells was inadvertently giving him more time to document everything. I appreciate you breaking it down for me. Sometimes all these fancy technologies can be confusing. That got exactly the reaction he expected. Wells launched into a condescending explanation of how his servers were the future of banking, complete with oversimplified gestures and a patronizing smile. All the while, Ray's hidden cameras captured every detail of the modified cooling system. You know, Wells continued, clearly enjoying the sound of his own voice, I started from nothing, just like you. But the difference is, I used my brain. Some people are just meant to stay at the bottom, doing simple jobs like fixing pipes. Ray nodded again, making sure to look appropriately impressed. Meanwhile, his tiny receiver picked up a coded message from his team. They were receiving all his transmissions perfectly. They now had clear evidence of how Wells was using the building's infrastructure to steal banking data. Sir, one of Wells' assistants interrupted, poking his head into the room. Your next meeting is in 5 minutes. Right, Wells waved his hand dismissively. Just finish up here quickly, he told Ray. And remember, don't touch anything you don't absolutely have to. Though I suppose that's good advice for you in general, isn't it? He laughed at his own joke as he walked out. Ray allowed himself a small smile as he finished documenting the last modifications. In his experience, there was nothing quite as useful as being underestimated. People like Wells were so convinced of their own superiority that they never stopped to question why a simple plumber might spend extra time examining their sophisticated cooling systems. The evidence was clear now. Wells had created an ingenious system for stealing data, hiding it within the building's normal infrastructure. It was exactly the kind of arrogance Ray had seen countless times before, brilliant people who thought they were too smart to get caught, who never imagined that the quiet man fixing their pipes might be the one to bring them down. As he packed up his tools, Ray could hear Wells starting another meeting, his voice full of confidence as he prepared to impress more potential investors. The billionaire had no idea that his empire was about to come crashing down, all because he couldn't see past his own prejudices to recognize the truth standing right in front of him, dressed in a simple blue work uniform and carrying a wrench. The afternoon light was starting to fade from the penthouse windows as Ray began wrapping up his work. He'd spent hours methodically checking every pipe in the massive apartment, gathering more evidence with each inspection. Now came the trickiest part of his mission, presenting the bill and making his exit without raising suspicion. Wells had grown increasingly agitated throughout the day. His phone kept buzzing with messages, and Ray's trained ear caught fragments of worried conversations about bank security updates and tight deadlines. The pressure was clearly getting to the billionaire, making him even more unpleasant than before. Finally finished? Wells demanded, barely looking up from his phone as Ray approached his desk. You've been wandering around my home all day. I should have called a more professional service. Yes, sir. All done now, Ray replied, keeping his voice mild as he pulled out his invoice pad. I'd found and fixed the leak in the server room, checked all connected pipes, and made sure there won't be any problems with your cooling system. Wells snatched the invoice from Ray's hand, his face turning red as he read the total. $300? For a simple pipe repair? This is highway robbery. That includes the emergency call-out fee you agreed to this morning, sir, Ray explained patiently, plus the additional inspection you requested of all connected systems. I never requested any additional inspection. Wells stood up, using his height to try to intimidate Ray. You're trying to scam me, aren't you? Thinking you could pad the bill because I'm wealthy. Ray maintained his calm demeanor, though he noticed how Wells' security team had subtly moved closer. It's all itemized on the invoice, sir. Standard rates for our services. Standard rates? Wells laughed harshly. Let me tell you something about standard rates. I could buy your entire shabby little plumbing business with what I make in an hour. In fact, he picked up his phone, fingers flying over the screen. Let's see what the internet has to say about your professional services. Ray watched quietly as Wells pulled up his business's review page. The billionaire's face lit up with malicious glee. Well, looks like I can leave reviews. How about I let everyone know about your fraudulent billing practices? I wonder how long your business would last after a few one-star reviews from someone of my standing in the community. Sir, if you'd like to discuss the bill, Ray started, but Wells cut him off. Discuss? There's nothing to discuss. I'm going to bury your pathetic little operation. By the time I'm done, you'll be lucky to find work unclogging toilets in a gas station. Just then, Wells' phone buzzed again. His face changed as he read the message, worry creeping into his expression. What do you mean, unauthorized access? He muttered, seemingly forgetting about Ray as he rushed to his computer. Ray took the opportunity to start packing his tools, moving unhurriedly despite the growing tension in the room. He could hear Wells barking orders into his phone. Check all systems now. I want to know how they got through our security. Wells slammed his phone down and pointed at Ray. Don't you dare leave yet. How long were you working near those servers? Just long enough to fix the leak, sir, Ray answered truthfully, though he left out the part about his sophisticated scanning equipment having documented every detail of Wells' illegal operation. If I find out you touched anything else. Wells let the threat hang in the air as more warning messages popped up on his screen. His security team was now openly watching Ray, hands hovering near their weapons. But Ray just continued calmly collecting his tools, decades of training helping him maintain his perfect cover. He could see the fear growing in Wells' eyes as more alerts appeared on his screens. The billionaire's perfect system was starting to crumble, and he had no idea that the quiet plumber he'd been threatening was the cause. Sir, one of the security team approached Wells, speaking quietly but not quietly enough for Ray's trained hearing to miss. We're detecting sophisticated scanning signals. Someone's been collecting data all day. Wells' head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Ray with new suspicion, but the plumber was already heading for the door, tool belt jingling softly with each step. Stop him, Wells ordered, but Ray had already pressed the elevator button. The doors opened immediately. His team had made sure of that. Have a good evening, sir, Ray said politely as he stepped into the elevator. You can mail the payment to the address on the invoice, though you might want to do it soon. I have a feeling things are about to get quite busy around here. The last thing he saw before the doors closed was Wells' face transforming from confusion to dawning horror as alarms began blaring throughout the penthouse. Sometimes, Ray thought to himself as the elevator descended, the most satisfying part of his job was that moment when people finally realized how badly they'd underestimated the quiet plumber with the toolbox. The peaceful quiet of the elevator ride was broken by the sound of alarms echoing through the building's shaft. Ray could hear the chaos erupting in the penthouse above as he calmly pressed the button for the parking garage. His hidden earpiece crackled with updates from his team. Everything was going exactly as planned. Meanwhile, 60 floors up, Wells' perfectly controlled world was falling apart. His security team scrambled around the penthouse as more alerts flooded their screens. Someone had been gathering data all day, right under their noses, and they had no idea how. "Check everything," Wells shouted, his usual smooth confidence completely gone. "Every computer, every server, every single device in this building." His face had gone from red to pale as he watched his security systems falling one by one. One of his tech experts was frantically typing at a computer. "Sir, they've copied everything. The banking protocols, the transfer codes, all of it. But I don't understand. Our systems show no outside breach." "What do you mean, no breach?" Wells grabbed the young man's chair, spinning him around. "Someone's clearly hacked us." "That's just it, sir," the tech expert explained, his voice shaking. "Nothing was hacked. All the access looks completely normal, like someone was physically here, accessing everything directly." Wells froze, his mind racing back through the day. Who had been in the penthouse? His regular staff, the morning's business visitors, and his eyes widened as realization began to dawn. "The plumber," he whispered. "Where's the plumber?" "Already in the elevator, sir," one of his security team reported. "Should we stop it?" Wells rushed to his main security station, pulling up the building's camera feeds. There was Ray, standing calmly in the elevator, still looking every bit the simple plumber with his toolbox and worn work boots. But something was different now, something in the way he stood, the way he looked directly at the camera with a slight smile. "Run facial recognition," Wells ordered, his fingers trembling as he typed. "I want to know exactly who we just let walk around our servers all day." The computer beeped as it searched its databases. Wells' face went even paler as the results appeared on his screen. The man he'd spent all day insulting wasn't just any plumber, he was one of the most decorated intelligence operatives in the country's history. "Lock down the building," Wells screamed into his phone. "Nobody gets out, especially not that elevator." But it was too late. His own security systems were turning against him, locked out by commands that had been quietly installed throughout the day. Every time Ray had knelt to check a pipe, he'd also been planting sophisticated override codes in nearby electrical systems. In the elevator, Ray adjusted his tool belt as he watched the security cameras switch off one by one. His team had mapped the building's entire network while he worked, and now they were shutting it down systematically. He could imagine Wells' frustration as each attempt to stop the elevator failed. The elevator doors opened smoothly into the parking garage, where everything looked perfectly normal. The same security guard sat at his desk, though Ray noticed the slight nod that marked him as another undercover agent. They'd had teams in place throughout the building all day, waiting for this moment. "All done up there?" the guard asked casually as Ray walked past. "Just about," Ray replied with a small smile. "Though I think Mr. Wells might be calling for more repair work soon." As he loaded his tools into his van, Ray could hear sirens in the distance, right on schedule. His team would already be securing the building's exits, preparing for the federal agents who were about to swarm the place. His phone buzzed, not his plumber's phone, but his secure agency device. The message was simple: evidence received. All systems locked. Proceed with arrest. Ray took one last look at the towering building above him. He could almost picture Wells in his penthouse, finally understanding how completely he'd been fooled. The billionaire had spent all day looking down on the quiet plumber in his home, never realizing he was actually looking down at his own downfall. "You know," Ray said quietly to himself as he started his van, "people really should be nicer to their plumbers. You never know who might be behind that toolbox." The sound of approaching sirens grew louder as he pulled out of the parking garage. Through his rearview mirror, he watched federal agents' vehicles converging on the building. Wells' perfect world was about to come crashing down, all because he couldn't see past his own prejudices to recognize the truth that had been right in front of him all day. Sometimes, Ray thought, the best disguise isn't just about how you look, it's about understanding how others see you. Wells had chosen to see a simple plumber, someone he could mock and belittle. That choice had blinded him to the reality of who was really standing in his home, calmly taking apart his criminal empire one pipe inspection at a time. The sound of running footsteps echoed through the penthouse as Wells' security team rushed to secure the building. But it was already too late. Their security systems were completely locked out, and federal agents were surrounding the building below. In the midst of the chaos, the private elevator dinged softly as its doors opened once again. Wells spun around, expecting to see his security chief. Instead, there stood Ray, still in his blue work uniform, holding his toolbox. But something was different now. The quiet, hunched posture was gone, replaced by the straight-back stance of someone used to command. "Forgot something," Ray said simply, his voice no longer carrying that carefully maintained tone of submission. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 pieces of paper, your plumbing bill and your arrest warrant. Wells stumbled backward, knocking over his expensive chair. Who are you really?" "Exactly who I said I was," Ray replied calmly. "A plumber with 20 years of experience. I just happen to have another job too." He set his toolbox down with a solid thunk that made Wells flinch. "You know, if you'd bothered to actually check my credentials instead of just assuming I was beneath your notice, you might have spotted some inconsistencies." The billionaire's security team reached for their weapons, but Ray just smiled slightly. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. The building is already surrounded, and your communications are blocked. Plus," he gestured at the cameras, "everything happening right now is being broadcast live to federal agents downstairs." "This is impossible," Wells whispered, his face ashen. "You're just a plumber. I saw you working all day, fixing pipes." "Oh, I did fix your pipes," Ray assured him. "I take pride in doing good work, no matter what the job is, but while I was at it, I also documented every piece of evidence showing how you modified your cooling systems to steal banking data. Quite clever, actually. Not many people would think to look at the plumbing." Wells lunged for his computer, but the screen was already locked. "What did you do to my systems?" "Nothing that wasn't already there," Ray said, walking slowly around the room. "Just helped myself to some copies of your files. Though I have to say, for someone so concerned about security, you made it surprisingly easy. Too busy looking down on the help to notice what we might be up to." The sound of helicopters grew louder outside the windows. Wells rushed to look down at the street, where police lights were flashing 60 floors below. His perfect world was crumbling around him, and the man he'd spent all day insulting was the cause. "You can't do this to me," Wells snarled, his cultured voice cracking. "Do you have any idea who I am? I have connections, lawyers." "And I have evidence," Ray interrupted calmly. "Hours of recorded conversations about your plans to rob banks. Complete documentation of your modified systems. Proof of every transaction you've ever stolen." He smiled slightly. "Amazing what you can get done when people think you're just a simple plumber fixing their pipes." The elevator dinged again, and this time it was filled with federal agents in tactical gear. Wells' security team, seeing the odds, wisely put their hands up. But the billionaire himself wasn't quite ready to give up. "I'll pay you double whatever they're paying you," he offered desperately. "Triple. Name your price." Ray shook his head slowly. "You still don't get it, do you? This was never about money. It's about right and wrong. It's about people like you thinking you can steal and cheat because you believe you're better than everyone else." He turned to the federal agents. "Everything you need is downloaded and secured. His entire operation documented from the inside out." Ray picked up his toolbox, its weight now lighter without all the surveillance equipment. "Oh, and Mr. Wells? About that plumbing bill you were so upset about. Consider it on the house." Wells could only watch in stunned silence as his empire collapsed around him. The man he'd dismissed as a simple plumber had just destroyed everything he'd built, all because he couldn't see past his own prejudices. "One more thing," Ray paused at the elevator. "Next time you call a service worker to your home, try being a little nicer. You never know who might be behind that uniform." The federal agents moved in with their handcuffs as Ray stepped into the elevator. Through the closing doors, he caught one last glimpse of Wells' face, the arrogant billionaire finally understanding how completely he'd been outplayed by the very person he'd spent all day looking down on. 2 weeks later, Ray was back at work, kneeling under someone's kitchen sink with a wrench in his hand. The morning news played quietly on a nearby radio, discussing yet another story about the spectacular fall of tech billionaire Benjamin Wells. "Can you believe it?" his current customer asked, gesturing at the radio. "A spy pretending to be a plumber. Sounds like something from a movie." "Pretty interesting story," Ray agreed mildly, carefully tightening a pipe fitting. He'd been hearing variations of this conversation at every job since the news broke. The headlines had been spectacular. Billionaire's empire crumbles due to undercover plumber. Tech genius outsmarted by handyman. Spy with a wrench takes down criminal network. The investigation had revealed everything. Wells had been using his building's sophisticated systems to steal millions from banks, thinking his scheme was too clever to be detected. But in the end, his own prejudices had been his downfall. He'd been so convinced that a simple plumber couldn't possibly understand his technology that he'd practically given away all his secrets. Makes you think twice about how you treat people, the customer continued, watching Ray work. I mean, you never know who somebody really is, right? Ray smiled as he remembered Wells' face in those final moments, when the billionaire finally realized how completely he'd been fooled. That's true. Though honestly, I think the real lesson is simpler than that. It's just about treating everyone with respect, no matter what job they do. He finished the repair and started cleaning up his tools. His phone buzzed, a message from his other job. Another case was coming up, another criminal who thought they were too clever to get caught. But that could wait. Right now, he had 3 more plumbing jobs scheduled for the day. The customer walked him to the door. You know, my friend was saying all plumbers might be spies now. She laughed. I told her that's ridiculous. I mean, what are the chances my plumber is secretly some kind of agent? Pretty unlikely, Ray agreed with a quiet smile. Though I have to say, plumbing is actually perfect training for investigative work. You learn to spot problems, trace things to their source, and fix issues that other people don't even notice. He drove to his next job, thinking about how the past 2 weeks had changed things. Wells' arrest had made international news, and his confession had led to dozens more arrests across the country. The stolen money was being returned to banks, and thousands of people's savings were now safe. But what really stuck with Ray wasn't the big headlines or the dramatic arrest. It was the smaller moments throughout that day. Every time Wells had looked right through him, every dismissive comment, every assumption that someone who worked with their hands couldn't possibly be intelligent. People like Wells never seemed to understand that there was no such thing as just a plumber or just any other job. Every person had their own story, their own skills, their own worth. Sometimes the quietest person in the room was the one you should watch most carefully. His next customer was waiting when he arrived, an elderly lady with a leaky faucet. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," she said warmly, offering him a glass of water. "You know, I was just reading about that plumber who turned out to be a spy. Made me think about how we never really appreciate the people who keep our world running smoothly." Ray set down his toolbox and accepted the water with a thank you. This was why he kept up his plumbing business even when he wasn't on a case. There was something satisfying about solving real problems for real people, about doing work that actually helped others. "My grandson asked me if I thought you might be a spy too," the old lady chuckled as she showed him to the bathroom. "Just a plumber, ma'am," Ray replied with a gentle smile. "Though in my experience, that's more than enough to keep life interesting." He knelt down to examine the faucet, his trained eyes automatically noting everything about the house's layout, the photos on the walls, the potential escape routes. Old habits died hard. But for now, he was exactly what he appeared to be, a skilled tradesman doing honest work. The radio in his van crackled quietly, his team keeping him updated about the next big case. But that could wait. Right now, there was a leaky faucet that needed fixing, and Ray took pride in doing every job well, whether it was catching international criminals or just keeping the water flowing in an elderly lady's home. After all, he thought as he reached for his wrench, sometimes the best disguise isn't a disguise at all. Sometimes it's just about being exactly who you are and letting other people's assumptions do all the work for you.